There is a hill in the middle of nowhere that broke history in half. Not a famous hill. Not a hill you will find on any tourist postcard or in any school textbook your children ever brought home. Just a quiet, dusty rise in the ground in southeastern Turkey, surrounded by fields that farmers had plowed for centuries without a second thought. Sheep grazed on it. Children ran across it. The wind passed over it the same way the wind passes over everything ordinary. And beneath it, sealed under layers of earth so thick and so deliberate that it took 12,000 years for anyone to notice, was something that should not exist. Something that our entire understanding of human civilization says was impossible. And once you hear what was found inside that hill, you will never look at the story of humanity the same way again. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Think about everything you were ever taught about how civilization began. You were probably told something like this: for most of human history, people were simple. They hunted animals. They gathered berries. They moved from place to place because they had no choice. And then, slowly, over thousands of years, they figured out farming. And farming led to settlements. And settlements led to cities. And cities led to writing, to religion, to art, to everything we call civilization. That is the official story. The one in the textbooks. The one every historian, every professor, every documentary you have ever watched has told you. And on the surface, it sounds reasonable. It sounds logical. It sounds like a clean, tidy explanation for how the human race went from nothing to something. But what if it is wrong? Not slightly wrong. Not off by a few centuries. What if the entire foundation of that story, the timeline, the sequence, the basic assumptions, what if all of it is built on a lie that a single hill in Turkey has been quietly disproving for the last 30 years? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand the weight of what was found, you have to understand the world as it existed before the discovery. The year is 1994. A German archaeologist named Dr. Karl Muller, a man described by every colleague who ever worked alongside him as meticulous, almost maddeningly careful, the kind of man who would spend an hour brushing dust off a single stone just to make sure he hadn't missed anything, is conducting a survey of ancient sites in the hills near the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey. This is not glamorous work. Most archaeological surveys end in nothing. You walk. You look. You record. You move on. Previous researchers had passed through this same area decades earlier and concluded it was unremarkable. One survey had labeled it a medieval cemetery and closed the file. But Karl Muller was not the kind of man who accepted closed files. He had a reputation for seeing things others missed, for looking at a landscape and reading it the way you might read a face, slowly, carefully, looking for the thing hiding just beneath the expression. And on a windswept hill that locals called Potbelly Hill, a name so ordinary it almost sounds like a joke, Karl Muller looked down. And he saw stones. Not random stones. Not the kind of jagged, scattered rock you find anywhere in the Turkish countryside. These stones were shaped. Deliberately, precisely shaped. And they were old in a way that made his hands go still. Karl Muller began excavating in 1995 with a small team and almost no funding, in the way that most world-changing discoveries begin, quietly, without fanfare, without anyone paying much attention. And what came out of the ground in those first months stopped the team cold. Massive stone pillars. T-shaped. Some of them standing over 18 feet tall. Some of them weighing close to 10 tons each. Arranged in perfect circles, the way furniture might be arranged around a fireplace, except the scale of it was enormous and the precision of it was extraordinary. The pillars were limestone, carved from bedrock quarries located hundreds of feet away and somehow transported to this hill by people who, according to everything archaeology had established, should not have been capable of this. These were not primitive scratches. These were not accidental formations. These were the deliberate work of minds that understood geometry, that understood construction, that understood how to organize large numbers of people toward a single, sustained purpose across what researchers would later determine was multiple generations of building. And then the carvings came into focus. The surfaces of those pillars were covered with carved snakes, foxes, lions, scorpions, vultures, and birds so lifelike they seemed ready to leap off the stone. Medium, animal after animal, rendered with an artistic skill and an attention to detail that belonged, by every established measure, to a civilization thousands of years more advanced than the one the evidence said was living here at the time. The team kept digging. The more they dug, the larger the site became. The more pillars they found, the more questions mounted. And then the carbon dating results arrived. And the number that came back was the number that broke the story open. 11,600 years old. Confirmed. Retested. Confirmed again. These massive carved stones were approximately 11,000 years old, crafted and arranged by prehistoric people who had not yet developed metal tools or even pottery. Smithsonian Magazine, let that land for a moment. The people who built this place did not have metal. They did not have pottery. They did not have the wheel. They did not have writing. They did not have agriculture. By every conventional measure of what it takes to build something like this, they had nothing. And yet there it was. A monumental complex of carved stone circles, engineered with geometric precision, decorated with sophisticated symbolic art, constructed on a scale that required thousands of workers, sustained coordination, long-term planning, and a social structure complex enough to feed and organize all of those people across decades of building. Carbon dating delivered what researchers called an intellectual sucker punch. These sophisticated structures were created 11,600 years ago, 7,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza and 6,000 years before Stonehenge. Medium, the textbook said this was impossible. The evidence said it happened anyway. And the academic world did not respond with open arms. Some researchers called it the most important archaeological discovery of the 20th century. Others pushed back immediately, almost defensively, the way people push back when something threatens not just their conclusions but the entire framework they have built their careers on. The dating must be wrong, some said. The people could not have been organized enough, said others. The complexity had to have a simpler explanation. But the dating was not wrong. And the complexity had no simpler explanation. And gradually, reluctantly, the scientific consensus shifted. This was real. This had happened. And nobody could explain how. Here is the detail that keeps researchers awake at night, the one that gets quietly skipped over in most news coverage of this site, the one that changes the entire character of the story. Archaeologists discovered that Potbelly Hill was not a settlement. There are no cooking hearths, no sleeping quarters, no storage rooms, no trash piles, no signs of permanent habitation of any kind. Study.com, nobody lived here. The people who built this place traveled to it, worked on it, gathered at it, and then left. They came from somewhere else, assembled here for purposes that archaeology has not yet been able to fully decode, and they maintained this site, cared for it, returned to it, for over 1,000 years. Think about what that means in human terms. For more than 1,000 years, longer than the entire span of the Roman Empire, generation after generation of people passed down the knowledge of this place, the commitment to it, the reason for it, without writing, without cities, without any of the institutional infrastructure we associate with the preservation of culture. They held this in their memory. They kept coming back. And then, one day, they stopped. And what they did next is the part of this story that no one has ever fully explained. They buried it. Not an earthquake. Not an invasion. Not a flood. After approximately 1,600 years of use, Potbelly Hill was deliberately buried. Layer upon layer of sediment was carefully packed around the pillars, preserving them for modern discovery. Medium, someone filled it in. On purpose. Methodically. And then they walked away and left this place to the earth for 12,000 years. Why? Why would the people who spent generations building something this extraordinary, maintaining it across centuries, treating it as sacred enough to return to again and again, why would they choose to seal it? What were they protecting? What were they afraid of? Or what were they trying to preserve for someone who had not yet been born? The answer, or at least the closest thing to an answer that modern science has been able to piece together, begins with a carving on a single pillar. Pillar 43. Researchers call it the Vulture Stone. It stands in one of the oldest enclosures at the site, covered in a dense arrangement of animals and symbols that for years were interpreted as purely decorative, the kind of religious imagery you might expect at an ancient gathering place. But in 2017, a research team at the University of Edinburgh decided to look at those symbols differently. They analyzed the carvings to find out if they could be linked to constellations. Phys.org, not just for artistic purposes, but as a functional record, a star map encoded in stone. And what they found changed the interpretation of this entire site. Using a computer program to show where the constellations would have appeared above Turkey thousands of years ago, they were able to pinpoint a specific date encoded in the carvings, 10,950 BCE, which corresponds exactly to the beginning of the Younger Dryas period according to ice core data from Greenland. Phys.org, the Younger Dryas was not a minor climate fluctuation. It was a geological period that took place between 12,800 and 11,500 years ago, marked by a suddenly occurring mini-ice age, a time of environmental catastrophe, worldwide animal extinctions, and major changes in human culture and population. Gaia and the University of Edinburgh team said the carvings at Potbelly Hill show evidence that a comet triggered this event, that what the Vulture Stone is recording is not mythology, not abstract art, but a real catastrophe. A comet strike. Witnessed by human beings. Carved into stone so that no one who came after would ever forget it. The archaeologist. The leading theory holds that a fragmented comet, or multiple comets, slammed into the Earth or exploded in the atmosphere, triggering widespread wildfires, darkening the sky with dust, and causing the vast North American ice sheets to melt rapidly. This influx of freshwater shut down the ocean currents that regulated global temperature, leading to dramatic, sudden cooling across the entire planet. J.D. Lemke and the people at Potbelly Hill, or their ancestors, had seen it happen. Or they had inherited the memory of it from people who had. And they carved it into stone because stone was the only thing that would last. This is the part of the story where the ground shifts beneath your feet. Because if the Vulture Stone is really a record of a comet impact around 10,950 BCE, then the people who carved it were not primitive beginners stumbling towards civilization. They were something far more haunting than that. Construction at Potbelly Hill seems to have begun around 9,600 BCE, just as the Younger Dryas was ending and the world was beginning to warm again. Imagine what this means. For over 1,000 years, the survivors and their descendants had held onto the memory of the catastrophe. They passed the story down through generations, a sacred narrative of the time the sky burned and the world went dark. J.D. Lemke, and when the climate finally stabilized, when the world was habitable again, they came back to this hill. They gathered their people. They quarried their stone. They picked up tools they had no metal to make and began to build the largest, most complex structure the ancient world had ever seen. Not because someone told them to. Not because a king commanded it. But because they remembered. And they needed the world to remember with them. The Younger Dryas is viewed as a crucial period for humanity, as it roughly coincides with the emergence of agriculture and the first Neolithic civilizations. Before the impact, vast areas of wild wheat and barley had allowed nomadic hunters in the Middle East to establish permanent base camps. But the difficult climate conditions following the catastrophe forced communities to come together and work out new ways of maintaining their crops, through irrigation, selective breeding, sustained cooperation. Reinhardt, in other words, civilization as we know it, cities, writing, religion, farming, everything, may not have been the natural, gradual product of human progress over time. It may have been the desperate, grief-stricken response of survivors trying to rebuild a world that had been taken from them in a single catastrophic moment. The civilization did not begin at Potbelly Hill. The civilization that built Potbelly Hill may have been a civilization already in its second chapter, trying to write its way back from an ending most of us never knew occurred. There is one more layer to this story, and it is the one that should stay with you the longest. Researchers discovered that the builders of Potbelly Hill relied on geometry to construct the monolithic structures. Computer modeling revealed that workers used geometric planning across the entire site, indicating it was built as a single unified complex and not as individual structures added randomly over the years. History: this was not improvised. This was not accidental. This was a planned city of the sacred, laid out with mathematical intention by people who understood spatial geometry without a calculator, without a blueprint, without a university education. They held it in their heads. And what their heads contained was, apparently, more than we have given them credit for across the entire history of modern archaeology. And yet, after 30 years of excavation, researchers have uncovered only a fraction of what lies beneath that hill. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the surrounding area reveal that what has been dug up represents perhaps 5% of the full site. The remaining 95% of Potbelly Hill is still underground. What lies beneath in its full extent, how many more enclosures, how many more pillars, how many more carvings, no living person yet knows. Karl Muller spent the last 2 decades of his life pulling these secrets from the earth, and he died in 2014 with most of them still sealed beneath his feet, with research and observations accumulated over 20 years that the academic world is still working to fully process. He believed he was close to a larger interpretation. He told people that Potbelly Hill was only one piece of something much bigger, that the pattern it represented was scattered across the ancient world in places no one had yet thought to look. He never got to finish that sentence. And that silence, that unfinished thought left behind by a careful, meticulous man in the middle of the most important work of his life, that is perhaps the most haunting detail in this entire story. Here is what the evidence, taken together, is trying to tell us. 12,000 years ago, something happened. Something catastrophic and sudden. A sky event so devastating that the people who survived it built the largest stone monument in the history of the ancient world just to remember it. They encoded the date of the disaster in astronomical symbols that would survive longer than any human memory could. They buried the entire structure deliberately, carefully, as if they understood that the earth would protect what the air could not. And then they scattered. And the knowledge of what they had built, the full truth of who they were and what they knew, scattered with them. But not entirely. Because across the ancient world, in cultures separated by oceans and centuries and every conceivable barrier to communication, the same story kept appearing. The same flood myths. The same sky catastrophes. The same memory of a time before the Great Forgetting, when human beings knew more than they were supposed to know, built more than they were supposed to be able to build, and understood the cosmos in ways that modern science is only now beginning to rediscover. The hill in Turkey was the first crack in the wall. And the more archaeologists dig, the more that wall comes apart. The real question, the one that should follow you after this video ends, is not what was buried 10,000 years ago. It is what is still buried right now. What other hills are sitting unremarkable in some corner of the world, plowed by farmers, grazed by sheep, labeled as medieval cemeteries in a survey nobody bothered to reopen? What other secrets are waiting for the right person to look down at the right moment and see, in the shape of a stone, something that was never supposed to be forgotten? We nearly lost this one. We nearly walked past it. One careful man looked down. And the story of humanity changed forever. What are we still not looking at? Tell me what you think in the comments below. Where in the world are you watching this from? And do you believe there is a civilization hidden in our past that we have not yet found? I read every single comment. And if this video made you see the ancient world differently, subscribe to the Pattern Weavers. Because every week, we find the threads that history tried to hide. And we are just getting started.